Charles Cornwallis and the Race to the Dam, as well as several other books he has up here. So I'll let him talk about that myself. Trying to always do a little research before I come. I found out the name of Cornwallis's horse was Gunpowder. And he was named Gunpowder because he could smell gunpowder from a long way away. He would either scream or blow his nose like horses do, that kind of thing, and it would warn that whoever was on him that there was danger around. So I just thought that was really cool. I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Waters. Thank you all for coming today. The best thing, in case you leave before the end, the best thing you can do for us is, if you're able to, is join as a member for the Historic Association. That really does help us out. We do a lot of research, and the extra funds do go a long way. We put your money to very good use. I'll turn it over to Mr. Waters. Thank you.
Thank you very much. How's my voice? I'm usually able to carry pretty well. If you can hear me, I'd rather not use the microphone. Okay. Is that okay, Cindy?
If you can't hear, raise your hand, and if enough people raise your hand, you'll go back to the microphone.
Okay, fair enough. Fair enough. So, thanks again for having me out today. It's a pleasure to be here. Really excited to be invited to speak to y'all today. This is, I've been doing these talks for a while now, but this is the first time that I've been able to do one in my new hometown in Pittsboro. So it's nice to be here today. Get to tell you a little bit about my books. Again, my name is Andrew Waters, and this presentation is called The Race to the Dam, A Resilience Theory Perspective. Oh, hold on.
Sure, it's turned on. It was on, and it was working.
It was working before.
Yep. Well, yeah, but hold on. Oh, there it goes.
Okay, it just needed to be loosened up. So I'm a native of Hendersonville, North Carolina. Some of you may know where that is. My career has actually been in land conservation, land trust work. I've worked at 3 different land trusts in the Carolinas, and I am currently employed as your farmland preservation coordinator for Chatham County. Now, I did get my PhD back in 2022. I'm very proud of that, but my degree is not in history. It's actually in natural resource policy. So I like to let my audiences know that I'm not a professional historian. I consider myself an amateur historian. I'm just someone who always wanted to be an author, always wanted to write books, and I've been able to marry that interest with my interest in the American Revolution in the South. And to that point, this is actually my second book, To the End of the World. This is the book about the race to the dam that I'm going to talk to you about today. My first book is called The Quaker and the Gamecock. It's also about Nathanael Greene, specifically about his relationship with the South Carolina militia general Thomas Sumter, that happens after the race to the dam. And I'm really excited to let you know that my third book is coming out actually in just a few days. I think it's on Amazon.com, is coming out November 12th. So this book is called Backcountry War, The Rise of Francis Marion, Banastre Tarleton, and Thomas Sumter. So actually, I wrote these books in reverse order. This third book is going back to look at what happened in South Carolina before the race to the dam. So I'm not going to really talk about the race to the dam from a chronological perspective for most of this presentation. So I'm just going to go over what the events that I cover in the book to give you some orientation about the book. The book really opens with Cornwallis's victory at Camden on August 16, 1780. Now, this was Cornwallis's greatest victory of the war, with him in overall command. I used the Battle of Camden to introduce this concept that historians have come to call the Southern strategy. Now, by 1780, the American Revolution had become very unpopular back in England. It had become very expensive for the British government, and it was creating political jeopardy for King George and his government. So they were desperate to try to bring the war to some kind of resolution. And the strategy that they came upon was that if we can reestablish control of the former southern colonies and move up the eastern seaboard towards the Chesapeake Bay, then Washington will essentially be forced to come out of his defenses around New York City and enter into some kind of decisive conflict, which is gonna bring the war to a resolution. So following the Battle of Camden, Cornwallis is preparing to move into North Carolina, the next step in the Southern strategy. Meanwhile, Nathanael Greene comes and takes command of what they called the Southern Department of the Continental Army. There was a Northern Department, which Washington was in command of, and then the Southern Department. So Greene takes command of the Southern Department in early December of 1780 from Horatio Gates, who had been humiliated at the Battle of Camden. Greene makes a very unusual decision to split his army into two different parts, and I'm going to talk about that later in the presentation. But this leads to the Battle of Cowpens on January 17th, 1781. And one of the things that my book does, which is a little bit different from other histories of the race to the dam that you may see out there, is that I really cast the Battle of Cowpens as the beginning of the race to the dam. And I'm going to explain a little bit about why I do that in just a moment. Following the Battle of Cowpens, Cornwallis is chasing Morgan across North Carolina. This leads to a battle at a place called Cowan's Ford on February 1st, 1781, a battle we don't really hear a lot about these days, primarily because the site of that battle is now submerged under Lake Norman. The Americans, or the Continentals, escape across the Yadkin River on February 3rd, 1781, in very dramatic fashion, with the British Army just pulling up on the southern bank of the Yadkin as the Americans are unloading their boats on the northern bank, and Cornwallis and the British kind of shaking their fists at the Americans in frustration. And then again on February 14th, the Americans escape across the Dan River in similarly dramatic fashion, with the British not quite as right behind, a few hours behind, but again, Greene and the Continentals are able to escape this British pursuit. So most histories of the race to the Dan really focus on this latter part of this time. And that's kind of the traditional era that's called the race to the Dan. And my book, again, expands the horizon of that time and looks at a little bit broader picture of what was going on that led to the race to the Dan. So this is a map from the book that basically just shows you that chronology that I just went over with you. Here's Morgan going off into western South Carolina in late December, the Battle of Cowpens, and then these two armies chasing each other neck and neck across the center part of North Carolina. Now, one of the reasons that I wanted to write this book, that I felt like I could bring something unique or special to this story, was that I felt like I shared a certain perspective on this landscape with Nathanael Greene. Now, in land trust work and land conservation work, we're always studying the river corridors, the riparian corridors. And we're trying to assemble these large chunks of undeveloped land, which create a variety of conservation benefits. There's water quality benefits, viewshed benefits for people that are recreating on the river, habitat benefits for the animals that are using these rivers to move up and down, migrate along the rivers. And Greene, of course, wasn't studying the rivers of the Carolinas from a conservation perspective, but he was studying them from what I would call a social ecological perspective. He was studying the ways that humans interact with the rivers and the landscapes of the Carolinas. So even before Greene arrives in Charlotte in December of 1780, he has sent out 3 survey teams to survey these river corridors and to document what's going on in these river corridors. And so he's documenting where there are boats on the rivers that can be used to get people across, back and forth across the river. He's documenting where the rivers can be forded, where they can be marched across or walked across. He's documenting how long it takes to ride or march from one river crossing to another river crossing. He's even collecting information about the ways that the river functions after inclement weather. So how long after heavy rain will it take for the river to rise to a point where it can't be forded, where you can't move an army across it? And then how long until the river is going to go back down to the point where it can be? So he's thinking about this landscape from a very social, ecological perspective. He's thinking about how humans can interact with this landscape. Now, he is thinking about it from a logistics standpoint. He wants to be able to move supplies, troops up and down these rivers. But nevertheless, he's thinking about the landscape of the Carolinas. And so in my conservation career, I worked in 3 land trusts. My first job was at the Catawba Lands Conservancy that focused on the Catawba River. My next job was at the Land Trust in Salisbury, North Carolina, that focused on the Yadkin River. And then my most recent job in land conservation was at the Spartanburg Area Conservancy, which focused on the Broad River. So of the 4 river basins where the action of the race to the dam takes place, I had worked and was kind of looking at the landscape from a conservation perspective in 3 of those 4 basins. The last one is the Dan River, which is up here, which is in the Roanoke Basin. So I felt like I understood this landscape in a way that was similar to the way that Nathanael Greene was experiencing it. And I wanted to bring that perspective into this book. And so when I was writing this book and first published this book and was starting to go out and talk about this book, I was finishing up my PhD at Clemson University. I was thinking about a way to kind of make this information interesting to a group like you all. And I was, at the same time, I was very interested in this idea of ecological resilience. I had become very fascinated with this concept of ecological resilience. And so I'm going to use ecological resilience to compare the 2 organizations that I write about in the book. But before we can talk about ecological resilience, we have to think about this idea of equilibrium thinking or equilibrium theory. Now, equilibrium theory comes out of an earlier age of ecological thought, ecological theory. Basically, it's the idea that each actor in an ecosystem has their own role, their own function. And if you just leave that ecosystem alone, then the ecosystem is going to operate at maximum efficiency. It's going to coalesce around this equilibrium point where every part of the ecosystem is acting in harmony with the other parts. It's kind of a divine engineering perspective on ecosystems. And humans, being humans, we have decided, well, we can manage for equilibrium. We can engineer around equilibrium. You know, we can have roads, we can have development. As long as we're kind of maintaining those baseline functions of the ecosystem, we can manage around this idea of equilibrium. Resilience theory emerges in opposition to this idea of equilibrium theory. So resilience theory is saying, no, ecosystems don't organize around this optimum point, this equilibrium point. They're actually transitioning and going through different phases of organization and development. And one of the key tenets of resilience theory is if the dominant actors in an ecosystem consume too much of the resources in that ecosystem, then you're going to cross over into what they call threshold. So at that point, the ecosystem gets totally out of whack. It starts to function in an entirely different manner. And of course, the preeminent example of threshold that we're thinking about today is climate change. You know, we know that humans are influencing our climate and our environment. We just don't know what's on the other side of that threshold. We don't know if human life can be sustained, if we can live after we cross over this threshold of climate change. So in resilience theory or resilience thinking, the focus shifts from, okay, we can manage the ecosystem. We can engineer the ecosystem to continue functioning at or near equilibrium. It shifts to one of adaptation. We're not going to manage the ecosystem. We're going to manage our own behaviors. We're going to do what we need to do to avoid these kind of threshold moments. So it's a subtle shift in perspective, but it's a very important one. It's the difference between thinking about how to engineer our environment to thinking about how we can change our own behaviors to accommodate the changes that are going on in the environment. And we can use these two models to talk about our two organizations that are involved in the race to the dam. I quote one historian in the book who says that the British Army in the late 18th century was the most sophisticated bureaucracy that existed in the world at that point. It was an organization where each soldier had a very specific role. They had very specific equipment, very specific training. It was an organization where each department had its own very specific function and role. And the management theory, the management philosophy was that if each department does their job, if each soldier does their specific job, then the Army is going to be able to operate at maximum efficiency. The Continental Army was an entirely different kind of organization. It was an organization that came together on an ad hoc basis. It was an organization whose officers had very little military experience, very little military training. It was an organization that was constantly having to adapt, constantly having to make do with the resources that it had at hand and to the conditions that it was experiencing on the ground. And we can also use these two models to compare our two main protagonists, the two protagonists of the book, Nathanael Greene and Charles Cornwallis. Now, here is Greene. He's born in 1742 in Rhode Island. He's essentially self-educated. He does not have a formal education growing up, but those who knew him, even as a young man, as a boy, as a young man, remarked on his incredible intelligence. He was a very bright young man. He was very attracted to the idea of empiricism that was kind of filtering up through the Enlightenment and coming over to America. So he was someone who was very attracted to this idea that, no, we don't need the formal hierarchies of government, of university, of the church to discern the true nature of reality. We can use our own minds, our own experience, our own knowledge to tell what's true and what can work. He becomes the youngest general in the Continental Army in 1775. He shows up outside of Boston as the general of the Rhode Island militia, kind of a dubious distinction. Apparently, it wasn't much of a fighting force. And one of the great mysteries about Nathanael Greene's career is how he got to be this general. We really don't know how he became the leader of this organization, probably through some family political connections, but still there's very little documented history about how he got to be the general of the Rhode Island militia. But he is one of these militia generals who show up outside of Boston, and when Washington gets there a month later and forms the Continental Army, all of these militia generals become generals in this new organization, the Continental Army. And Greene is the youngest one. He pretty quickly establishes himself as Washington's most talented battlefield commander, his most talented officer. And after Gates is humiliated at the Battle of Camden in August of 1780, Washington is finally able to give Greene his first independent command. He becomes the commander of this part of the Continental Army that was called the Southern Department, which essentially operated as its own organization or its own semi-independent organization. So Greene is someone who is schooled in empiricism by his own kind of quest for knowledge, his own military experience in the Continental Army. Cornwallis was an entirely different kind of man, an entirely different kind of leader. He was born in December of 1738, and in 1762, he inherits his father's title of Earl. This makes him a peer of the realm. He is in the highest echelon of British society, of British aristocracy. And in fact, he has a very close personal relationship with King George III, which serves him very well. He was considered the British Army's best fighting general, but he has a tendency to check out psychologically and emotionally when things don't go his way. The most famous example of this is at the surrender ceremony in Yorktown, when he just refuses to show up at the surrender ceremony. But there's a very prominent example of this also in the Race to the Dam that I write about and I use as a way to explore Cornwallis's psychology a little bit. Here's a quote from the book. "The British officer who dared to confront the bureaucracy or conventions of the British Army not only threatened his military career, but also his societal position." So the British Army was an organization bound by the social conventions and hierarchy that preserved the social caste of British society. And Cornwallis was at the very tip top of that hierarchy. So he had even less motivation to challenge those hierarchies than someone else who was at a lower level of British society. It was also an organization bound by the conventions of 18th century warfare, which were largely based on these large-scale battles, these conventions and rules of war that had developed out of the wars on the continent earlier in the century. So here's a map of the Carolinas that I'm going to use to give you an example of Greene's adaptation and how it influences the race to the Dam. So this is the situation that Greene encounters when he arrives in Charlotte in December of 1780. Cornwallis is here at a place called Winnsboro, South Carolina. He's just waiting for 1,500 reinforcements to get to him from Charleston to Winnsboro so he can start this invasion of North Carolina. He can start the next step in the Southern strategy. He's got two main outposts, one here at Camden guarding his eastern flank, and one here at a place called 96 in western South Carolina guarding his western flank. Has anybody ever been to the 96 historic site in western South Carolina? It's really a fascinating part of the National Park Service. I would encourage you to go check that out. Now, Cornwallis's plan is basically to march right up the Great Wagon Road, which I suspect you all are familiar with, and move right into North Carolina, establish control in North Carolina, essentially the same way that the British had been able to do in South Carolina. And he believes that Greene is pretty much obligated to try to stop him the same way that Gates had tried to stop him at Camden. Now, Greene inherits an army of only 1,700 Continental soldiers. He's got a few more militia there with him, but he doesn't consider his militia very reliable. The army that he does have with him, they've been fighting for months. They were actually, the Maryland and Delaware troops were sent down to try to fight the British at Charleston. They got there too late. They had to move back up. They've been moving up and down the Carolinas. They're exhausted. They're worn out. So Greene makes a very unusual decision to split this army of 1,700 men in two. And he takes the 1,100, the rawest, least trained part of that army, to a place called Cheraw, South Carolina, here on the Petey River. And he sends his most talented officer, Daniel Morgan, into Western South Carolina with what has come to be called the Flying Army. This was the best part of his army, his Delaware and his Maryland infantry, his Continental Cavalry. So that was, he sent his best guys over into Western South Carolina, and he took his rawest guys with him to Cheraw. Now, he understands perfectly well that he is leaving the door open for Cornwallis to move right into North Carolina. And there's a military convention of the day that says you never split an inferior army in the face of a superior army. It came from Frederick the Great earlier in the 18th century. And the idea was that if you split your inferior force, then the superior force is just going to pick you off one by one. They're going to go after each part of your army. And your best chance of doing something to stop the progress of the superior force is always going to be to keep your inferior force together. That's going to give you the best opportunity that you're going to get to stop the superior force. Greene is well aware of this convention. He's well aware of the political jeopardy that he's putting himself in by defying this convention. However, he realizes that by splitting his army into two, that now he can threaten Cornwallis on his flanks. So basically he's saying, okay, Cornwallis, you go ahead into North Carolina. I'm going to stay behind, and now I can attack you at Camden, or possibly even Charleston with my army at Cheraw, or Morgan can attack you at 96. Now, this part of Western South Carolina was the scene of a particularly brutal and vicious civil war throughout the course of the American Revolution. It was roughly evenly divided between loyalists and what we'll call patriots. At the beginning of the war, the patriots had been ascendant, and they had really repressed the loyalist community. There was certainly political repression, in many cases, physical repression, violence, sometimes looting, burning. And following the British capture of Charleston in May of 1780, and after they'd reestablished control of South Carolina, this unleashes a round of payback. Now the loyalists are in command, and now it's time for revenge and retribution for all of this abuse that they've been suffering throughout the course of the American Revolution. So this is civil war in the worst sense of the word. Families fighting families, communities fighting communities, looting, pillaging, burning, violence, even murder. And the loyalists of Western South Carolina are really worried that if Cornwallis goes ahead and moves in to North Carolina, then Morgan is going to be able to take 96 and reestablish control of Western South Carolina. And this is going to unleash another round of this civil war. And so they are begging and pleading with Cornwallis to do something about Morgan on his western flank. Now, Cornwallis knows what Greene is doing. He understands perfectly well what Greene is doing. He's not really that worried about it. He doesn't think Greene has the manpower to really do anything to threaten him on his flank, certainly not to threaten Charleston. But something happens at the end of December that I write about in the book. There is part of Morgan's force fights and essentially massacres a body of loyalists at a place called Hammond's Store in late December. And following this massacre, the loyalists of Western South Carolina this unleashes a wave of hysteria, that they're convinced that Morgan is next going to move on 96. It's going to kick off another round of this Civil War. So finally, Cornwallis can no longer ignore this political pressure. Finally, he has to do something about Morgan on his western flank. So what he does is he sends his best officer, a young officer named Banastre Tarleton, with 1,100 of his best troops, his light troops, his cavalry, to push Morgan off of his western flank. And this, of course, leads to the Battle of Cowpens. I write quite a bit about the Battle of Cowpens in the book. I don't have a lot of time to talk about it in today's presentation. Not only is the Battle of Cowpens one of the most significant American victories of the American Revolution, perhaps the most significant American victory of the American Revolution. Not only does Morgan achieve this very unlikely victory over Tarleton and his British regulars, but Morgan is able to take 800 of those troops prisoner. So Cornwallis, he was going to set off to North Carolina, take over all of North Carolina with 3,500 guys. Now he's lost roughly a quarter of that force to Morgan, and he becomes desperate to get those prisoners back, to take those prisoners back from.
Just curious, they're going up Green River Road, and you show the width of these being way wider. Do you know how wide a militia would take? You know, they don't just go up a road single file. They go like you show right here, right?
Yeah. Have you been to the Cowpens battlefield site? It's a wonderful site, and you kind of get the sense of the dimensions. But it's several hundred yards across here. And maybe we can talk a little bit more about Cowpens when I finish the presentation. So Morgan knows that Cornwallis is going to try to get those troops back. So he sets off across North Carolina. He's actually trying to get those prisoners up into Virginia, where the Continentals have some prisoner of war camps. But Cornwallis, who's so desperate to get these troops back, totally changes his plans to move into North Carolina up the Great Wagon Road. And instead he sets off after Morgan to try to get those prisoners back. And I argue the thesis or hypothesis of this presentation is that the Battle of Cowpens serves as one of these threshold moments for the Carolina theater of war during the American Revolution. And after the Battle of Cowpens, the whole landscape changes from one that favored Cornwallis, his superior manpower, his superior organization, the training of his troops, his superiority in equipment, his superiority in supply chain and logistics, to one that now favors Nathanael Greene and the Continental Army's ability to adapt and be resilient. So it's winter in the Carolinas. It's been raining all this time. Morgan is able to get across the Catawba River in advance of Cornwallis's pursuit. And just as he gets across, the river rises to a point where Cornwallis can't follow him. Meanwhile, Nathanael Greene races across North Carolina to join Morgan on the Catawba River. He sends his troops that were at Cheraw up to Guilford Courthouse. And Morgan arrives on the Catawba River, and he's meeting with a North Carolina general, William Davidson, who you may have heard of, the namesake of Davidson College. And Davidson says of Greene that even though he had never laid eyes on the Catawba River before, that he understood the river and the way it functioned better than someone who had lived on the river their entire life. So it's at this point during the race to the dam where we really see this research, this social ecological thinking, the way Greene had been thinking about the way that the armies were interacting with the landscape of the Carolinas, that really starts to pay dividends for Nathanael Greene. Not only does he know pretty much exactly when the British will be able to follow him across the Catawba River, he also pretty much knows exactly where they will try to cross at Cowan's Ford. He leaves Davidson behind to try to delay Cornwallis. He and Morgan continue this strategic retreat. They get to the Yadkin River. They know where the boats are. They get in the boats. They get across the river. By now, Cornwallis has gained a little bit of time on them, but they get across the river just as the British are coming up on the south bank of the Yadkin. I joked earlier they were shaking their fists at the Americans. Actually, what they did was they set up their cannons and they bombarded the northern bank of the river for a couple of hours. They were just so frustrated, so angry that Greene had been able to escape him on the Yadkin River. This gives Greene a little bit of time to get to Guilford Courthouse. He's able to reunite the two different parts of his army. Cornwallis, still in pursuit, he's able to ford at the Shallow Ford outside of Winston-Salem. Some of you may be familiar with that site. I believe there's going to be some kind of American Revolution interpretation at that site coming up. There was just a big preservation of some land up there at the Shallow Ford not too long ago. While Greene is at Guilford Courthouse, he debates trying to fight Cornwallis at this point because he knows that if he retreats out of North Carolina, that the people of North Carolina are going to think that he's leaving the state for Cornwallis. But this countryside is in so much disarray with these two armies following each other. The British, as they're marching through certainly this central part of North Carolina, between the Catawba and the Yadkin, they're burning, they're looting, they're pillaging homes. There's a great depiction of this part of the Race to the Dan, where the writer, I forget who it is talking about the armies, the British army spread out across the fields and the smoke from the burning homes kind of rising up behind them. Greene gets to go for Courthouse. He realizes that he's got to continue this retreat. He's got to keep retreating into Southern Virginia. So again, he sets off towards what was known as the lower fords of the Dan River. Again, he knows exactly how many boats are there. He knows that if he can get there before Cornwallis, that he'll be able to get across the river, and Cornwallis won't be able to follow him. Cornwallis at this point is getting bad intelligence from his loyalist supporters in this region. They're actually telling him that there's no way that Greene is going to be able to cross at the lower fords of the Dan River. So Cornwallis continues this pursuit. He's convinced that if he can come up on Greene, he can destroy Greene or force him to surrender. But again, Greene gets to the Dan River, he collects the boats, he gets across, and Cornwallis is unable to follow him into Virginia. And Greene has outfoxed him yet again. And so this is the period of the Race to the Dan. I know that the part of this campaign that influences Chatham County comes a little bit later in the story of Nathanael Greene and his campaigns in North Carolina. But hopefully this gives you some perspective on what happened during the Race to the Dan and what some of the key differences were between these two organizations and these two men during this incredibly exciting part of the American Revolution. And we can argue that had Cornwallis been able to catch Greene at one of these rivers, that in all likelihood, he would have destroyed the Southern Department or at least forced them to surrender. And who knows what influence that would have had on the outcome of the American Revolution, even what kind of influence that would have had on the United States of America, what the USA would look like today. But nevertheless, because Greene is the more adaptive leader, the more resilient leader, because he's able to escape Cornwallis again and again, and he's bringing as he's escaping, he's taking Cornwallis further and further away from his supply route from Charleston. He's really exhausting Cornwallis's army. His men, there's part of the book where they talk about how both armies are essentially marching in bare feet with blood kind of strewing the snow as they're marching towards the Dan River. And we can also argue that it's because of this Greene's resilience, his ability to outfox Cornwallis again and again and again, that Cornwallis kind of throws up his hands and says, well, forget about this part of the Southern strategy. I'm not going to mess with North Carolina. I'm going to move straight into Virginia, which creates the circumstances that lead to the surrender at Yorktown. So it is an indirect logic, but there is a connection there between what happens in the race to the Dan and Cornwallis's subsequent surrender at the Battle of Yorktown a few months later. So thank you very much for your attention today. I've got some time left for questions and discussion. Often this is the best part of the presentation for me, to get to interact with you. So who's going to start us off with a question or comment? Yes, sir.
What was it like trying to move the prisoners that they had taken?
Yeah, pretty successful. Morgan had actually sent the prisoners with another party. They were under the command of actually the South Carolina Militia General Andrew Pickens, who is this is his first major campaign where he kind of rises to prominence. So Cornwallis was very focused on Morgan, and this allows Pickens to get to Salem and then cross the Blue Ridge on the wagon road and get the prisoners to the Continental prisoner working. So they're actually very successful. Cornwallis does not get his prisoners back. The prisoners remain in American control. And this was very important because at the time, these prisoners were currency. You could trade prisoners back and forth between the two armies. And of course, the American army, persistently short on manpower, would find this more value because they needed to get their prisoners back more than the British needed to get their prisoners back.
So he lost that objective.
He did. Yes, sir.
Well, tease us with a little preview of how Chatham comes into the picture.
So that's a great question. I suspect there are people in this audience that know more about that than I do. Following the Battle of Guilford Courthouse, Cornwallis has had it. He's done with North Carolina. He's retreating towards Wilmington down the Cape Fear River. And that's the part that I understand has the most to do with Chatham. Now, you all may know this. I just learned this today. The Historical Association is actually doing a mapping project of Cornwallis's movements through Chatham County. And they're doing the research. When they kind of get the documentation they need, they're going to be able to put it on a nice GIS computer map so you can kind of follow the course of that. So you were lured here today with a bit of false advertising. But the sequel will be spectacular, I'm sure, once we get this map in place. Yes, sir.
How come you didn't mention King Mountain? Wasn't that part of the Cornwallis in there?
It was.
What's the
Yes.
question?
He's asking about Kings Mountain, which of course occurs in between the Battle of Camden and Greene's arrival in Charlotte in December 1780. The reason is because that didn't fit in my story.
Well, there was a militia from Western Virginia. There wasn't a West Virginia at the time that fought at Kings Mountain.
Yes,
I think it was under Isaiah,
yes.
and his last name Shelby,
Isaac Shelby.
Isaac
Yes.
Shelby, and that ended up coming down into, I believe, Pittsboro. There's some
Okay.
good stories out there on how the Americans were, well, I'm done with my duty, I'm leaving town,
Okay.
and, and so on.
Okay.
So
They settled here.
I think the person that owns our tavern was part of that militia.
Okay.
Patrick St.
Okay.
Lawrence, and I think he's one that owns and settled in Pittsburgh.
Yeah, there's a lot going on that I didn't work into my presentation, so don't consider this a comprehensive account of the race to the Dean. Yes, ma'am.
So from the beginning of where you started out talking about Greene and Cornwallis to the end, what kind of time frame is that? All of this toing and froing and stuff?
Yeah, the Americans get across the Dan on February 14th, 1781. Greene takes command. If we want to start with Greene taking command in Charlotte, I think December 2nd, 1780. So roughly 2.5 months. All of this is occurring. And then, of course, the Battle of Guilford Courthouse takes place a month later. A lot of books. I brought this book today to share with you. This is actually the book that inspired me to try to write my own accounts of this part of the American Revolution. It's a book called The Road to Guilford Courthouse by an author named John Buchanan. He starts with the British capture of Charleston in May of 1780 and ends with the Battle of Guilford Courthouse in March of 1781. So that perhaps is a kind of a more natural horizon. But one of the reasons that I wanted to write a book specifically about the race to the Dan was it's just a great story. It's a very dramatic campaign. And I'm fascinated with Nathanael Greene. He was a fascinating man, a fascinating leader that we really don't hear a lot about today. But the other reason was because I got on, when I read about the race to the Dan in this book, I got on Amazon.com to see if anyone else had written a book about the race to the Dan, and nobody had. So I thought, okay, here's a marketing opportunity. I can write a book about the race to the Dan.
Would you give us a teaser about Nathanael Greene?
Nathanael Greene, I used the analogy a couple of times. I think in this book, and certainly in my writing of Cornwallis he was a checker player. He was a very linear thinker. He was very much bound by these conventions, these hierarchies of the British Army. You know, we have no indication that Cornwallis ever sent out any kind of survey team, any kind of scouts to explore the landscape of the Carolinas the way that Greene had done, even though he's getting ready to try to take control of this whole giant state with 3,500 troops. He was relying on his map makers to do that. And he was relying on his loyalist supporters to tell him about this landscape. Greene is the chess player. He's thinking 2 moves ahead, 3 moves ahead. He's always thinking about, okay, if this happens, what am I going to do in that case? If this happens, what am I going to do in that case? He's a brilliant thinker. He's actually not only a brilliant strategist, he's a brilliant supply guy. He had spent quite a bit of time during the American Revolution as Washington's quartermaster general, kind of managing the supply part of the Continental Army. He had famously said, nobody remembers a quartermaster general in history. And he had been pretty miserable in this role this whole time. Washington said, no, I really need you to handle this department, Greene, because he was such a brilliant organizational thinker, a logistical thinker. But Greene wanted to get back into the action. He wanted to get back into combat. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I believe Washington actually replaced another guy named Buchanan and put Greene as quartermaster of Valley Forge. And so when he saw that action, I think that was probably with the result of Gates, riding off in the sunset, to send him on down there in part because of quartermaster. Also, at least in my view, I believe it was Cornwallis was going to go to Charlotte. That was going to be the next big base. And then he was going to use that as a jump off point. Whereas he gets lured into Cowpens, and even though it becomes a chase, he's luring him further and further and further away from his own supply line. And then he burns his wagons, and he's going like crazy. And the thing about your watershed review is that the terrain isn't necessarily, it's not, I'm from New Jersey, there's a lot of campaigning there, but that isn't terrain here. Terrain's like this, marching up and down, and up and down, up and down. I think the fastest march from Guilford to the dam that Greene did, they covered something like 50 miles, in like 3 or 4 days, through the rain, through the mud, through everything else, got across the river, and then some American cannon returned the favor when Cornwallis showed up. So, and at that point, he knew he may have wanted to chase him, but he didn't have, there was no ammunition. He lost, a third of his army. And now you got to go, you say go to Wilmington. How far was that?
Yeah, he refers to a point in the book that actually is where the title of the book comes from. Cornwallis, one of the reasons Cornwallis can't catch Morgan is because he's got all his supply wagons. He's got all his wagons, all his camp followers. So he gets to the Catawba River and he realizes that he's never going to be able to catch the Continental Army with all these wagons, all these camp followers. And so he orders this giant bonfire and he makes all of his troops put all of their stuff in this fire. He burns all of his wagons and he vows to pursue Nathanael Greene to the end of the world. So that's where the title of the book comes from. And just as this gentleman said, he basically burned a lot of his supplies and equipment because he thought he needed to be more mobile to catch
Light infantry.
Greene.
Would solve the day.
That's right. But when Greene escapes across the Dan River, now that becomes a liability. Now he doesn't have any of his supplies and his equipment.
I couldn't help but think when you were talking about the rules of war, and the adaptation about Bill Cosby's rules when he discusses it like a football game. Essentially, the British will have to wear red and march in a straight line. The Americans can hide wherever they want to and shoot them. It's hilarious.
Yeah,
But it is that.
to a certain degree, yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, ma'am, over here.
Was there a Mrs. Nathanael Greene, and does he have any descendants?
Yes, he does have a son. I don't know more about it than that. I know that he did marry kind of just before the war started. Her name was Katie Greene. Very interesting character in her own right. At that point, the wives would be able to come to the Continental Army's winter camp. And Katie was a kind of a notorious flirt. She would often dance with the other officers, and it was said to be Washington's favorite dance partner. And this created some conflict and tension in Nathanael Greene's marriage. And so after the war, Greene actually, he tries to become a plantation planter. It's kind of a bummer ending to the story of Nathanael Greene because he hires slaves and tries to regain this fortune that he lost during the American Revolution as a planter. He dies fairly soon after that. We think of heat stroke. We don't really know, but Katie Greene goes on and runs this family plantation, which is over on the coast of Georgia. And it's still there today. It's a famous island. It's in the book. Yes, sir.
There's a whole nother book there because she and Sue were trying to get the Congress to pay back money that Greene used from his own fortune to supply the troops. And I think she was unsuccessful after all they.
It's in this book. Because Thomas Sumter was one of the main ones trying to stop the federal government from reimbursing the Greene family. Sumter had become so disgruntled with Greene due to the conflict that they had been in the latter part of the American Revolution. He was, I believe he was a congressman at this time, and he actually leads the opposition to the federal government effort to reimburse Greene for all of this debt. which they do, as a matter of fact. Sumter's not successful, but I talk about that part of Greene's history in my first book, Quaker and the Gamecock. Maybe you have one more question. Yes, sir.
There's so much talk about the race to the Dan and whatever, as if when they got to the Dan, the war was over. Well, it wasn't, obviously. But Cornwallis was so low on troops and men. How much of a military engagement went on from crossing the Dan to getting to York?
Well, the Battle of Guilford Courthouse is kind of the primary one here in North Carolina. I mean, a month later, Greene comes back to North Carolina because he had promised that he would return. He said, I've got to retreat now, but I'm going to come back. Don't worry. And he fulfills that promise. He comes back. At that point, he is able to gather the militia of North Carolina, and they are able to fight Cornwallis at Guilford Courthouse. It's famously said of Greene that he was the best general of the American Revolution that never won a battle. Because he essentially lost at Guilford Courthouse and a number of different other battles that he fought. But Greene, again, Cornwallis suffers so many casualties at Guilford Courthouse that's part of his reason for abandoning North Carolina, for moving on. So yes, my book is not the definitive history of the American Revolution in the Carolinas or Virginia. There's a lot more that goes on. One more comment. Yes.
Let's take that.
Give us our various.
All right. Okay. One last comment. I'm sorry, sir, but we can talk after the presentation.
I think the question over here at one point about Greene, there are several Quakers in this room, and I was wondering if you could give us a personal glimpse of him apart from military technology that he employed, as far as how Quakerism might have influenced the way in which he fought the.
Yeah, there's a lot about that in the book, so you need to read the book. Greene's Quaker heritage is really a fascinating part of his upbringing and his thought processes. And I write in the book, you probably know more about this than I do. I'm getting ready to put my foot in my mouth, but about this Quaker practice of discernment, where the young Quakers would sit with the elder Quakers and they would really kind of debate these philosophical questions about the nature of the universe and what all this means. And this Quaker heritage really influences Greene's kind of mental outlook. And what I talked about earlier about how he's someone who's not bound by convention. He looks to his own mind and his own kind of empirical understanding to try to decide what the right thing to do is. But Greene leaves the Quaker faith. As soon as his father dies, we don't really know. But we think he basically got caught at a tavern with one of his buddies, and the Quakers are gonna do whatever Quakers do when you get in trouble with the Quakers. And he says, to heck with this, I'm leaving the Quaker faith. So he did not consider himself, he considered himself of Quaker heritage, but not an active Quaker. So thank you so much. We're about out of time. Thank you.
Well, I'm thrilled there's so much interest in Cornwallis and Greene. This proves the map we're working on is going to have some real supporters to it. I hope Mr. Waters will maybe come to one of our meetings for the Cornwallis. We start getting the map closer, so you might be able to give us some advice on things we have right or wrong. Please, if you're not already a member of the Historic Association, please do join. It does help us. And please come out next time. Thank you so much for being here today.